This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it a few more minutes for folks to trickle in, so just hang in there, and we'll start in just a few minutes. Hi, everyone. We're going to wait just a few more minutes, probably till about 1:04, to get started while folks are logging on to the webinar. So sure you've muted your lines, and we'll get started here soon. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days. Welcome to the GEO AquaWatch webinar series. It's been 10 years of webinars. They generally run from September to May, and they're one about every other month, so about 6 a year. And Amalia is our first speaker this year to kick off the series. If you're interested in participating in the seminar, contact Mary Beth Neely. This is a friendly reminder to also please mute your lines for the benefit of all participants. So it's my personal honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Amalia Handler. She is an affiliate faculty at Oregon State University. Amalia is curious about how small organisms can control big things like nitrogen cycling, water quality, and our climate. She's earned her bachelor's degree from Franklin and Marshall College and a PhD from Arizona State University. Her doctoral work examined nitrogen cycling in streams and wetlands using biogeochemical and ecosystem ecology approaches. Amalia's most recent work was at the United States Environmental Protection Agency Office of Research and Development, developing models to identify which U.S. lakes are more likely to be impacted by water quality issues, especially related to harmful algal blooms. On a more personal note, I've seen Dr. Handler consistently bring fresh ideas and a spirit of collaboration that frankly elevates every project she tends to touch. I'm confident her leadership and contributions will continue to shape our field in meaningful ways. So please join me in welcoming her to this seminar series. Amalia, it's all yours.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Blake, and it's been a real pleasure getting to work with you. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come in, join me on this journey across the lower 48 states of the US. My name is Amalia Handler, and I'm going to be sharing with you some of the work that I did with a bunch of my colleagues to try and identify mountain lakes across the US for the purposes of trying to understand their status and condition. As much as possible, I've tried to intersperse lovely photos of mountain lakes that I've had the pleasure of visiting, or at times I've incorporated photos from others throughout the course of this talk. And I'll just note that I have kind of a multi-screen situation going on, so I might be awkwardly looking off to the side from my camera, but just know I have you, the audience, in my mind throughout this talk. So the work that I'm going to share with you today, you can read the full article. It's available in Ecological Indicators. It's an open access journal article. And I also just want to acknowledge all of my co-authors on this project, including Blake, who were really fantastic in helping to bring this project to fruition and see it through the publication process. It was a really great experience to work with a lot of folks, some of whom I hadn't had a chance to work with before. Okay, so diving in a little bit about mountain lakes. These are systems that have really high cultural significance. I talk with people all the time that have very, very dear memories of mountain lakes that they've interacted with at some point in their lives. They are often considered water towers of the world, or mountain areas in general are considered water towers of the world. Water that is deposited on mountain systems often flows downstream to major population centers, and so they're really important components of that water supply system. They support unique biota, and in addition, uniquely sensitive biota to global change, and as a result, mountain lakes are oftentimes looked to as sort of sentinels of change across the globe in terms of climate change or certain types of pollution, things like that. But until recently, their status as a population was really largely unknown. And so we were really curious, given all of the important aspects of these systems, what was the overall status and condition of these lakes across the US. But in order to do that, we had to figure out where are the mountain lakes in the US. So I'm going to try as well as I can to not assume familiarity with the US geography throughout my talk, but apologies in advance if I do occasionally make that assumption. So here's a map of the lower 48 states of the US with some other areas included. It's a map of the relief of the US. And so if you're familiar with it, there's a lot of mountain regions in the Western US. I'm based in Oregon. I'm in the Willamette Valley, sort of sandwiched between the Cascade Mountains and a coastal range that lies between here and the Pacific Ocean. But there are mountain areas on the eastern US, the Appalachian Mountains, and a few other mountain ranges in the. And if everybody could just mute their lines, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Sorry about that, Amalia. Oh, there we go. Excellent.
Thanks, Blake. So there are a few mountainous regions in the eastern US, but they tend to occur at much lower elevations, and they're not nearly as widespread as in the western US. So thinking about these two different areas that are really different in terms of elevation, we wanted to think about, well, where are the mountain lakes in these two systems, and how could we figure that out? But backing up, we had to figure out first what constitutes a mountain lake. So this was a lot of, it's just really hard to pin down a definition. So sitting with colleagues in a room, I would often appeal to this opening scene from The Sound of Music, where Julie Andrews as Maria throws out her arms wide and sings the title song of the musical. This scene in particular is really iconic in cinematic history, but it also really, I think, evokes the alpine ecosystem. And this scene specifically was filmed in the Alps, specifically the Bavarian Alps. And in fact, the term alpine comes from this part of the world. And it's since taken on a more general definition to refer to high mountain ecosystems that are generally dominated by steep slopes and long periods of snow and ice cover. But that's where that term comes from. And so I often like to joke that if we think about alpine systems in the US, by the definition of it meaning the Alps, there are no alpine systems in the US. But again, it's taken on this more general definition. But alpine systems tend to occur at pretty high elevations. So it's a pretty restrictive sort of cutoff if you apply it to the US more broadly. And so here's a look at that. We investigated using an elevation-based cutoff for lakes to try and investigate mountain lakes across the US. And so here is a map of the lower 48 states. And this is taken from the National Hydrography Dataset on water bodies. And we categorize lakes in a couple of different colors based on elevation. And so what you see here are lakes that are between 5,000 and 6,000 feet, 6,000 to 10,000 feet, and then over 10,000 feet, which is sometimes 10,000 feet is used as a proxy for anything above that level is maybe considered an alpine ecosystem. But what I want to draw your attention to is that if we use this elevation-based cutoff, it really excludes pretty much all lakes in the eastern US. And we know that there are lakes in mountain systems in that part of the country that folks hold very dearly, and we wanted to be able to speak to the status of those lakes in addition. So an elevation-based cutoff probably wasn't going to work for identifying lakes both in the eastern and western US. So we wanted to figure out, well, mountain lakes are probably near mountains, so can we figure out where the mountains are in the US? And so just as a comparison, on the left in this slide is a picture of Swan Lake, which is in Rockefeller State Park in New York. This is really close to where I grew up. This is not near any particular mountain environment. This is downstate New York, just outside of New York City, versus a picture I took a couple of years ago of Thousand Island Lake in the Ansel Adams Wilderness area. This is in the Sierra Mountains of California. And these have, pretty clearly large mountains around the lake and some influence of that snow-dominated area. So we wanted to try and figure out, we know that there are these differences. We can't go to every lake and figure out if we want to sing the title track from The Sound of Music. So how do we try and quantify this trend to be able to identify lakes across the US? So the goals for this work were threefold. One was to develop this classification system for identifying lakes across the US. Two was that we then wanted to describe the characteristics of those lakes, since that was a gap that we identified. And then three is that we wanted to estimate the ecological condition of those lakes across the US. So diving a bit more into this first piece, now that I've introduced to you kind of the tensions that are at play here, what we turned to for this work was the National Lakes Assessment, which is part of the US EPA's broader National Aquatic Resource Survey program. You can read more about the National Lakes Assessment by following that QR code to the EPA's website. I'm going to try and say the National Lakes Assessment, but you may occasionally see on slides this acronym or abbreviation for NLA, and just know that that refers to this particular survey. It's conducted every 5 years, where approximately 1,000 lakes across the US are sampled according to a population-based sampling design. And what that means is that each of the lakes that are sampled across the US has an associated weight that relates to its overall representativeness in the population of lakes across the US. And so it's this sample that allows us to, through this population-based sampling design, that can help us understand the overall size and status of the population across the US. So in the summer, on this 5-year cycle, crews across the US in partnership with the EPA visit each of these 1,000 lakes, and they collect a whole suite of data that helps us assess the physical, chemical, and biological condition of lakes across the US. And just so that we're all on the same page, the population that is considered for the National Lakes Assessment are lakes that are at least 1 hectare in surface area and at least 1 meter deep. And that's important because in particular, very high elevation lakes in those high mountain environments can be quite small. And so just worth noting that this analysis doesn't include some of the smallest lakes across the US. So we drew from the lakes that were sampled in 2007, 2012, and 2017 National Lakes Assessment surveys, which in total was about 2,500 lakes across the lower 48 states. And then we wanted to figure out, okay, if we can classify which of these lakes are mountainous and which are not, we should be able to relate that back to the overall population of lakes across the US. So in order to figure out that classification scheme, we eventually turned to this landform classification. This is developed by the US Geological Survey. It's based largely on slope and relief using remote sensing imagery. And it divides the lower 48 states into these 10 land surface categories. And those are visible on the right of this slide. And luckily for us and this analysis, 2 of those categories include mountains. So there are low mountains and also high mountains and deep canyons. And just looking at the map of the lower 48 states, you can see that there's a lot of these orange and red spots across the western US, but there's also the presence of these colors in the eastern US. And so we were excited to find this data set because this was a way for us to be able to get at the mountainous areas across the US without having to rely on an elevation-based framework. So then we had to make a couple more decisions. Okay, we have a lake, it has a boundary associated with it. How close do the mountains need to be? How many mountains do there need to be before we count something as a mountain lake? And so there was a lot of discussion about this. I find it fascinating. I'm going to try not to talk about it too much in this talk, but if folks want to talk about it more, I'm happy to get into the details. But basically what we did was we took the lakes that were sampled in the National Lakes Assessment. We looked at the catchments for those lakes, which is the area that it describes the drainage area that drains immediately to this lake. So it's kind of an immediate sort of drainage area to the lake rather than the entire watershed, which could include, you know, potentially many miles or kilometers of streams that are draining to the lake and additional upstream lakes. And we made that decision for a couple of different reasons, but we just really wanted to look at kind of the immediate area around that lake for a definition of kind of mountainous, or for the presence of mountainous terrain. And so we looked at that USGS landforms data and we said, okay, how much of the catchment area, that immediate drainage area, is mountain landform versus non-mountain landform? And then we had to figure out, because of the structure of the National Lakes Assessment Survey and how the data works, we needed a binary. So it wasn't just enough to quantify the proportion of mountain land area, but we actually had to decide on a particular cutoff. So how much mountain landform has to be in that immediate drainage area in order for a system to count as a mountain lake. So we basically tried to reverse engineer this. We went to the literature, we pulled out about 20 lakes across the US. We tried to get lakes from both the eastern and western US. And we ran them through this process just to see, well, how much mountain landform is in their catchments, this immediate drainage area to the lake. And so what you're looking at here is the name of the lake, the state and where that lake occurs, the mountain range associated with it, and then the amount of the percent of the catchment area that is mountain landform. And so you can see there's quite a variety of mountain landforms across here. Depending on your familiarity, you might recognize a couple of these lakes on this list, but it was a big variety. I think the median was something like 49% or something like that, but it ranges from 0 to 100% across this scheme. And I'll note that Upper Lake Mary in Arizona, I used to live in Arizona before I moved to Oregon. While there was no mountain landform in the immediate drainage area for that lake, if you look at the entire watershed for that lake, it does include the San Francisco Mountains, kind of outside of the Flagstaff area. And so there are mountains in the vicinity of this lake. It's just using the extent that we pursued for this analysis, we weren't able to find any mountain area there. So just to kind of give you a sense of what this looks like, here are two mountains from that list, mountain lakes from that list. The first is the Loch in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. This is a system that has 81% mountain terrain around its immediate drainage area. And then on the right, we have Heart Lake, which is located in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. And this is a system that had about 47% mountain area. I'll note that we didn't distinguish between low mountains and high mountains in this analysis. We just kind of aggregated them together to look at total mountain area in the catchment. So that's an example of these two. So we really needed to figure out, well, we want to be pretty inclusive of mountain lakes across the US. And we still weren't quite sure which threshold to go with, but in order to be inclusive, we decided to go with the lower end. So we figured we would try out a couple of different cutoffs and just sort of see how that might impact the results. Did it super matter one way or another? And so the next portion of this analysis was that we did this process where we identified, okay, based on the amount of mountainous area in the catchment, how many of the lakes count as mountain lakes versus non-mountain lakes. And then we applied the weights from the National Lakes Assessment. And again, this is a weight that's assigned to each of the lakes that are sampled in the National Lakes Assessment that relates to its representativeness in the overall population. And so by applying those weights, we can estimate the population of mountain lakes and the population of non-mountain lakes. And so that's what's shown in this table. So we played around with a few different thresholds. So the leftmost column of this table is looking at a 1%, 5%, and 10%, and then finally a 25% cutoff of mountain area within the catchment or that immediate drainage area associated with the lake. And then what you see broken out here is the number of lakes that are sampled in the NLA that would then count as mountain lakes versus non-mountain lakes. And then in addition, the estimated population for the overall population of lakes across the US. Again, these are lakes that are at least 1 hectare in surface area and at least 1 meter deep in the summertime. And so what you can see, unsurprisingly, is that as we raise the threshold, as we increase the amount of mountainous area that's required in order to count as a mountain lake, the number of lakes sampled that count as mountain lakes goes down, and the estimated population size also goes down. So at a 1% threshold, we get about a bit over 13,000 lakes across the US that count as mountain lakes, versus if we raise that threshold up to 25%, it's closer to 10,000 mountain lakes. And so we see those numbers come out of the non-mountain lake population, but because that population is a lot larger than in the US, the overall impact is smaller. So regardless of kind of the threshold that we choose, we have about 180,000 non-mountain lakes across the US. So in order to be pretty inclusive of lakes from both the eastern and western US and lakes in kind of different mountainous areas across the US, we decided to go with this 5% threshold for this analysis. And so that's what this looks like. Here's a map showing the about 2,500 lakes that were sampled in the NLA. And the ones that are considered mountain, having at least 5% mountain area, are depicted in blue. And then in orange, it's the non-mountain lakes across the US. And so what we were happy about with this map is that it shows that we have sampled lakes both in the western and eastern portion of the US. Okay, so now we want to dig into a little bit about what are the characteristics of those lakes across the US. And so this next portion is going to be broken down by the eastern and western portions of the US. And so I'm just going to share with you a bunch of box plots that just show kind of the mean, the interquartile range, and then kind of the range of values associated with a couple of different characteristics. And so starting on the top left of this box plot, the elevation at which these lakes occur tended to be higher in the western US compared to the eastern US, which is expected. But I'll note that there's a huge range of elevations for the western US in terms of where mountain lakes occur. And just thinking about that really does make sense. I live in the Pacific Northwest. Our neighboring state is Washington. Washington is known for many things, among them the Olympic Peninsula, where just these wild and fantastic mountains are emerging almost straight from the ocean. And so you get these high slope and relief areas very, very close to mean sea level. And so you can get these mountain lakes even at pretty low elevations, even in the western US. Moving to the right from there, we also looked at how much mountain landform there was across the eastern and western US mountain lakes, and that tended to be a little bit lower for the eastern mountain lakes compared to the western, but again, a pretty big range for both of those systems. In terms of the overall mean slope of the area surrounding the lake, that tended to be a bit steeper in the western US, but again, big range. And eastern and western mountain lakes tended to be pretty similar in terms of their overall size with respect to lake area, and I think we also looked at watershed area and even depth. A couple of other characteristics that I'll share with you, these are related to land cover. So eastern mountain lakes tended to have more forested land cover compared to western mountain lakes. And western mountain lakes had more ice cover, perennial ice cover compared to eastern mountain lakes. But it was low in both of those systems. And then looking at agriculture and developed area, those tended to be low overall for mountain lakes across the US, but I'll just note that there's some variation there. So digging a bit deeper into this development piece for mountain lakes, we looked at the percent of developed area in both the catchment. So again, that's the immediate drainage area that goes directly to the lake versus the entire watershed. So that involves like any location that will eventually drain to that lake ecosystem. And so I'm showing this here for the mountain and non-mountain lakes side by side. And so the first thing to note is just that there's less developed area in mountain lakes compared to non-mountain lakes. And looking at kind of these overall means between the catchment and the watershed, they look fairly similar in terms of the intensity of development if you look at one scale versus another. But when we pair the watersheds and look at the ratio of how much developed area there is in the catchment versus how much there is in the overall watershed, what we find is that it's close to like 2.5 times the amount of development in the immediate drainage area around the lake compared to the watershed for mountain lakes compared to non-mountain lakes, which is still more intensive development, maybe about 1.5 times the amount of development in those catchment areas. But that's where we start to see a difference. And part of this could be related to just mountain lake systems have a higher slope and relief associated with them. The areas that are closer to those lakes are lower gradient. And so that's where you have the space available to potentially build. But in addition, that's also the really beautiful and scenic spot. And so maybe you want the development to occur close to that lake so that you have the views of that system. And just another component of this is a couple aspects of the physical characteristics of these lakes. And so I'll note that mountain lake catchments tend to have lower overall soil hydraulic conductivity. They tend to have more runoff compared to non-mountain lakes, and the depth to bedrock tends to be shallower. And so all of these physical characteristics could lead to a situation where development is maybe happening closer to the lake, and then the characteristics of those lakes make it such that pollutants are more easily carried to the lake ecosystem. So just to wrap up this particular section of the talk, we found that Western mountain lakes tend to occur at higher elevation and at steeper slopes. The developed land area tends to occur at higher rates, sort of near the lake shores in mountain lakes compared to non-mountain lakes. And then some of the physical characteristics of mountain lake catchments may make them more likely to convey pollutants from that developed area to the lake more readily. Okay, so the next piece that I want to share with you is about the condition of those mountain lakes. So the crews that visit these lakes are evaluating them for a whole suite of physical, chemical, and biological endpoints. And so we wanted to look at those for mountain lakes and compare them to non-mountain lakes. And so bringing back this graphic on this topic. So we've now figured out, okay, we're going to use this 5% threshold to identify mountain lakes versus non-mountain lakes. Now we're going to both apply the NLA weights, but also the condition information that we have on all those different indicators to then estimate the overall condition of the mountain lake population and compare that to the non-mountain lake population. So I want to give you a little bit of background on condition categories. In some cases, for some of the indicators that I'm going to talk about, those are just universal benchmarks that are associated with, for example, trophic status categories, or whether a given pollutant is detected or not detected, or over a particular level or not. But in a number of cases, the National Lakes Assessment uses these condition categories that are based on, that are relative to the best available reference sites within a given region in the US. And so in the National Lakes Assessment, there are 9 different ecoregions. Reference systems are identified within that region, and the data for a particular indicator of interest is plotted on something like this. And so this is for total phosphorus. And so it tends to be the case that lower overall phosphorus concentrations tends to be a better water quality situation for lakes. And so what they do is collect all the data for these reference lakes, they plot it, and they say, okay, anything below the 75th percentile, that's considered good condition, low phosphorus concentrations. The 75th percentile is the boundary between good condition and fair condition. So a little bit higher total phosphorus. And then finally, the 95th percentile is considered the boundary between fair condition and poor condition. So anything that's over that 95th percentile for this sort of best available reference sites within a particular region is considered poor condition, high phosphorus concentrations. And so those boundaries are set by looking at those reference lakes, and then you would plot the overall data, the entire collection of data for that given region using those percentile cutoffs, and then you can categorize all of the lakes within that region in this using this good, fair, poor condition categories. So hope that made sense. And can talk more about it in the question and answer if there are more questions about that. So getting into some of the results, first I'm going to share with you the results for biological condition. And so here are two indicators, the first being chlorophyll A concentrations, and the second being benthic macroinvertebrates. This is insects in the stream that can be a nice indicator of overall water quality. And so what you're going to see across the next couple of slides are these bar charts on their side, and the top row for each of these bar charts is going to be the mountain lake population, and then the bottom row is going to be the non-mountain lake population, and they'll be cut into these benchmarks, usually good, fair, poor, but there will be a couple of other benchmarks present in some of these data. And so looking across just these two initial ones, what we can see is that for chlorophyll A and benthic macroinvertebrates, we tend to have a higher proportion of mountain lakes be in good condition compared to non-mountain lakes. And then looking over on the rightmost side of this figure, more of the non-mountain lakes tend to be in poor condition compared to the mountain lakes. But again, don't want to discount the fact that there's still a pretty good proportion of mountain lakes that fall into these poor and fair categories with respect to these particular indicators. And that's a trend that you're going to see kind of throughout the next several slides that I'll share with you. Another indicator from the biological condition category is trophic status. This is really chlorophyll A under the hood, but just instead of these regional benchmarks, this is according to sort of standard accepted benchmarks between these various trophic states. And so what you can see here is that mountain lakes tend to be more have a higher proportion of lakes in the oligotrophic or mesotrophic status compared to non-mountain lakes, which have a higher proportion in the eutrophic and hypereutrophic status. So moving on to physical habitat condition, these are a couple of different variables that relate to habitat that's relevant to insects and fish, or overall vegetation cover. And on the bottom here, we also have a lakeshore disturbance, which is a measure of kind of anthropogenic, immediately visible anthropogenic influence along the lake shores. And so across all of these figures, again, what you can see is that a higher proportion of mountain lakes fall into these good categories compared to non-mountain lakes. And then there's also a higher proportion of the non-mountain lakes that fall into the poor condition category compared to mountain lakes. But again, I just want to emphasize here that while mountain lakes are in better condition across all of these categories, there can still be a pretty substantial proportion of mountain lakes that fall into these fair and poor condition categories. And in particular, I'll just point out the lakeshore disturbance on the bottom here. Close to 50% of mountain lakes are in fair or poor condition with respect to lakeshore disturbance. And I thought that was really surprising because kind of in my head, I was thinking about mountain lakes as being particularly, more remote and removed from human influence. but what we're seeing is that the presence of human influence along these lake shores can still be prevalent and obvious from the lakeshore. And then a few indicators related to chemical conditions. So acid neutralizing capacity is a measure of the ability of water to neutralize incoming acid. This was an example of the only indicator that we looked at that where there was a higher proportion of non-mountain lakes in good condition compared to mountain lakes. And this is probably in part due to many mountain lakes being generally more poorly buffered against acid compared to non-mountain lakes, but also could be in part continuing legacy of acid rain deposition in this area. And then looking at dissolved oxygen, total nitrogen, and total phosphorus, again, we see that trend where more mountain lakes in better condition than non-mountain lakes, and a higher proportion of non-mountain lakes in poor condition compared to mountain lakes. Again, I'll emphasize that there's still a substantial proportion of mountain lakes that are in fair or poor condition with regard to these categories. So 20 to 25% in poor condition for total nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus is still not great. And then finally, I'll just share with you one recreational condition estimate, since a lot of what my work involves is thinking about harmful algal blooms, in particular those caused by cyanobacteria that have the potential to produce toxins. And microcystin is one of the most commonly measured and detected cyanotoxins, at least in the US. And so this is just a detect, non-detect benchmark. And so what you can see is that mountain lakes tend to have fewer detections of microcystin compared to non-mountain lakes, which is great, but they're not without detections of this particular constituent. And so these harmful algal blooms are a concern across all systems, regardless of elevation and surrounding landscape and things like that. So to wrap up this section of the talk, we found that mountain lakes tended to be in better condition than non-mountain lakes across pretty much all of the indicators that we looked at, but there are still really significant challenges for a large proportion of mountain lakes with respect to a number of these indicators. And so I think that this is a really interesting future opportunity to explore the link between development and lake impacts. There were so many potential analyses that we could do that we just didn't have the capacity to get to. And here is a picture of a lovely lake, Mystic Lake, in Mount Rainier National Park in Washington that I had the pleasure of visiting last summer. And then wrapping up overall on this story of US mountain lake condition, these are systems that almost everybody has, seemingly almost everyone has a personal story about connecting with a mountain lake in some way, shape, or form. And they're really important, culturally, but also ecologically and economic resources, again, serving as those water towers for so much of the globe. And while they are in better condition than non-mountain lakes for most indicators, they're not without serious water quality challenges that really warrant sort of additional investigation and thinking about management and prioritization. And these mountain lake ecosystems, for potentially a number of reasons, tend to have more intensive development near their lake shores compared to non-mountain lakes. And because of the characteristics of these systems, they might be more vulnerable to the impacts from development. So even though development intensity is overall lower, because more of that development is happening near the lakeshore, and because of those physical characteristics, these systems might be more sensitive to these kinds of development impacts. So with that, I'll thank you so much for your attention and joining me today. I'd like to acknowledge again my co-authors on the paper and encourage you to reach out to me at my Oregon State email, which is posted here. I'm also available to connect on LinkedIn and ORCID, so you can check out my profiles there. And I'll just let everybody know that I'm open to opportunities out there in the world. And so if you're interested in connecting on research, or if you can think of places or organizations that might be interested in working with somebody like me, I'd love to chat. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. I think several people are expressing their reactions over the interwebs. This is Mary Beth, and I will moderate the question and answer period. You can use the hand raise feature if you like, which is part of the reaction button. You can also drop your questions in the chat, or just unmute and ask your question directly of Dr. Handler.
Thanks, Mary Beth.
Any questions? I do have one for you. And let me put my camera back on just to be nice. Hopefully I can be seen there. We invited you to give your talk in celebration of World Lake Day, and I just wondered if you had an impression, just from your research or maybe feedback you've gotten when presenting these results. Do people care, like when they're presented with sort of the information that you shared today, do they care most about preserving their lake, or a lake that they're familiar with from their childhood, or that they visited, or that is nearby them, versus caring about all lakes? Sort of like, is it a more personal thing, just from an awareness perspective? Just your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is I think that folks are, it's really fun giving this talk, because I get to hear all these wonderful personal anecdotes about the lake that is a lake, or maybe several lakes, that is very near and dear to people's hearts. And that's true also in my work on harmful algal blooms, which, you know, as I talked about very briefly, they don't discriminate. They impact kind of all different lakes, mountain and non-mountain lakes. And so I really enjoy getting to hear people's stories about lakes that are near and dear to them, and kind of the issues that they're having. And I guess what I would say is I find that when I give my talks, that tends to be an opportunity for folks that may not be as familiar with sort of lake ecosystems more broadly across the US, to realize that the issues that are facing the lake that's near them are not unique to that lake ecosystem. And so it kind of can serve as an opportunity to sort of open up their eyes to say, this is kind of a widespread phenomena that we're concerned about across the US. It's not just your local lake or beach or things like that. And so it can be an eye-opening experience, and it's really special to get to have that connection and sense of place about one particular lake, and then be able to use that connection to talk more broadly about this population of lakes across the US and across the globe.
Okay, thank you for that, for sharing that. Blake asked in the chat, can you talk about the potential of mountain lake vulnerability based on your analysis? Are there specific aspects that make these lakes more vulnerable to human impact that should make them an elevated priority for management or response, maybe?
Yeah, I think in my discussions with, so yes, I think that mountain lakes do have some characteristics that do make them uniquely vulnerable. They tend to have, they tend to be potentially more poorly buffered against acid, as I talked about in the acid neutralizing capacity. The the soils and slopes around mountain lakes sort of make it so that pollutants can be more easily conveyed from, potentially more easily conveyed from the surrounding catchment into the lake. And so I think all of that is potentially cause for concern, where even if the amount of development is lower, they may be more sensitive or are more directly or more quickly impacted from those development impacts. And then the other piece of it, I think, is that in my discussions with many states about this and other work that I do on populations of lakes, there's concern, one, about sort of where are the, the impaired waterways and what do we need to do to kind of help mitigate or restore those water bodies that are dealing with pretty significant water quality challenges. But there's also a component of identifying where are the high quality waterways in their particular region of interest, and making sure that they have policies in place to keep those high quality waters as they are, or maybe even better than they currently are. And so I hope that this kind of analysis, a lot of times, as we've seen from these condition estimates, like those higher quality waters are going to occur in those mountain ecosystems. And so I hope that this can serve as kind of a way to identify those high quality waters and serve as maybe a starting point for looking at some of these impacts and thinking about how to prioritize keeping those high quality waters as pristine as possible.
Since you were an insider until recently at the EPA, do you think that some of that work will be ongoing either in the next, the current administration or maybe future administrations?
Gosh, I'm not sure. I know that, yeah, there's a lot that is uncertain right now. I certainly hope that that will be the case.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Handler? Sully says, did you consider what portion of mountain versus non-mountain lakes were in protected areas, i.e. national parks?
Yeah, good question. We actually did. I didn't include that detail, but we did look at that, and it is included in the paper. I wonder if I can pull out. I don't think I have the numbers at my fingertips, but we did look at. We used the U.S. Protected Areas database to look at kind of what proportion of the mountain lakes occurred in. We looked at two classes of protected areas. One was, I think, pretty much any kind of protected area across the US. And then one was wilderness areas in particular, which don't allow any, in the US, wilderness areas don't allow any mechanized equipment within their boundaries. And so we did find that that mountain lakes tended to occur, unsurprisingly, on public land or protected land at higher rates than non-mountain lakes, and we're also in wilderness areas more often than non-mountain lakes. A little bit of that is, there's a lot more public and protected land in general in the Western US than there is in the Eastern US. And so a little bit of that is just kind of happenstance, but yes, we did find that was the case. And so that could be related to some of the like differing development impacts across those two populations.
So all the more reason to protect and preserve our natural areas as much as we can. Absolutely. In the US anyways. Yeah. Okay, I did just want to point out that, thank you very much, Dr. Handler, for your talk today. I did just want to point out that it is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on our website. About 24 hours. It takes a little while to get that up there for me to share that with everybody. provided the link in the chat, and you can access it, or just look for our YouTube channel. They're always posted there as well. Our next GEO AquaWatch webinar is on November 5th. It's covering the Ideation project, which is a European digital twin about interconnected inland waters. We'll have another hour-long presentation on that by Eloisa Bargiu from Setaqua in Europe. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Let's give Dr. Handler one last hand for her talk. And everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, Dr. Handler. You have a great day too.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. And thank you, Blake.
Yes, many thanks to Blake for our introduction too, and for just being a great guy all around.